You're listening to Addressing Gettysburg.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Addressing Gettysburg number 28. Ask a Gettysburg Guide number 28. I didn't need to ask anybody. I already knew. I looked it up this morning. Today we are talking about the Committee on the Conduct of the War. It's a little bit different for an Ask a Guide. Usually we go with battle stuff. It's always battle stuff. But licensed battlefield guides are well-versed in a lot of different things, and they have their own interests, and they do their own research, and they come up with some interesting stories and takes on different histories and things like that. So one of them is the Committee on the Conduct of the War. Now, this is an interesting story. First of all, let me get right to our guests here. We have two guests today. One is Louis Trott. He's in the studio with us. You know him from our Get Out of the Car tours, and he's been on Ask a Guide. You did one Ask a Guide, and then you did the Lincoln Connections to the Battle of Gettysburg.
About a year ago.
It was almost a year ago. And then that was on Patreon. And Mary Turk-Meena is on the phone. She's down in, where are you, North Carolina?
I am in lovely, sunny, and warm North Carolina.
Oh, so jealous.
We got the sun. We don't have anything else.
Yeah, we got sunny and cold Pennsylvania.
Yep.
Mary is...
Closed up Pennsylvania.
Yeah. Well, are you not closed there?
Not nearly like you all are.
Oh, wow.
That's a real state.
Yeah. I had to it's right. It's a real American state. I had to fight my way, down to this part of town just to do this. I had to hide behind bushes when cops would go by.
There you go.
It was amazing. But anyway, so Mary, this is your first time on the show. I saw you give a lecture, which, ladies and gentlemen, you can go back and listen to. When was that lecture, Mary?
Oh, it was last winter as part of the National Park Service Winter Lecture Series at the Visitor Center.
Yeah.
And it was January, February, maybe early February.
Oh, you don't remember the date?
Yep. I don't, but I could find it.
No, I mean, don't go to any trouble. Don't go to any trouble. But January, February, go look for it. It's still back there on the feed. Don't put yourself through any trouble there, Mary. Don't worry about it. They'll find it.
Well, I'm looking at my calendar, and I didn't mark it down on my calendar either. So, it's out there late January, early February.
You didn't mark it on your calendar. How did you show up for it?
I don't know. It must be on my phone somewhere.
All right. Well, anyway, I went up to Mary afterwards because she did a lecture on this, and just around that time, just a little before that, Louis and I had talked about doing this. In fact, Louis wrote a series of essays that are going to go out on our blog. Actually, after the new year, when we revamp the website, we're going to start finally releasing this stuff. And I said, "Look at this, Louis! You got scooped."
I know.
And we decided that somehow we have to pull the two people together. I went up to Mary after the show or after the lecture and invited her on, but now we finally got around to putting it all together, and so here we are. Mary, give us a little idea as to who you are. How did you become a guide? When did you become a guide, etc.?
Right. So I'm a retiree who has decided guiding is way more fun than all the stuff I did over my working career. Not that I didn't love what I did during my working career. I'm a lawyer and spent 35 years practicing law in Pennsylvania, New York, Ohio, and finally over the last 20 years since 2000 in North Carolina, mostly with large law firms. And doing what's called employee benefits law. So health care for company employees, retirement plans, 401ks, pension plans, executive compensation.
I used to work on the other side of that, where when people would call to get their stuff all set up, I would be the guy that would help them.
You were in the call center.
Yes, I was in the call centers, and I would help people, what's the word I'm looking for, understand the complexities of insurance and everything. It's crazy.
Oh, yeah. It's like, trying to distill that down into something that's understandable is one of the great challenges employee benefits lawyers and professionals have.
Yeah.
So I did that for a long time and had always been interested in history And it's actually my older daughter who kind of got me started on Civil War and Gettysburg specifically. Even though my mother grew up in Chambersburg, to her, Gettysburg was the dirty little town you turned right to go to Baltimore.
Really? Because that's what we think about Chambersburg.
I see. There you go.
You go there and you turn left to go to Hagerstown.
That's right. It's
which
all
is also
in the eye of the beholder.
Yeah, it is.
So she has some not very fond memories of Gettysburg, but my daughter became fascinated, of course, watched the movie and fell in love with Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain.
Who did?
AKA Jeff Daniels, right?
Right.
I hated to tell her that Chamberlain wasn't really 6'4" and blonde and gorgeous. Kind of busted it there. But I became enamored with the idea of kind of teaching history in a way that guides do, and thought, gee, what a better place in the country to do that than Gettysburg, without realizing what I had bitten off. You know, it's a test, right? No big deal.
Yeah.
And so it becomes a kind of a pursuit, as Lewis well knows and as many others know. And I was privileged to pass everything in 2016 in Lewis's class, and have guided over the last 5 years. Thoroughly enjoy it. Did a lot of tours last summer, this past summer, although mostly horseback tours, because the horses make sure you're socially distanced.
Yeah. So do bike tours, by the way, if you ever want to do a bike tour with us.
I said I would be happy to do bike tours. I love to bike across the battlefield, so sign me up.
Oh, all right.
It's my favorite way.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
it really is.
It's a great way.
It is. Yeah, it really is. And I think there are lots of things that you get to do and see on tours like that you don't get to do in a car when you're driving around on the high ground.
Absolutely.
So anyway, I've done those, and I actually did even before the winter lecture series on the Joint Committee. I did a foundation program. It was a 3-hour program on the Joint Committee. So what we've done and what we'll have to do today is distill this down into something that doesn't cover a lot of the details. There are lots of them. What's fascinating to me about this topic are kind of the number of nitty gritty little things that all feed into this. And because of the politics and the situation in the country and the untested constitutional provisions, it's perfect for lawyers, but it also brings in a lot of politics, but also greatly informs how we think about the Battle of Gettysburg, much more, I think, than we realize.
Yes, I know what you mean. I was reading Lewis's essay last night, and I go, oh, that's where we get that. And,
absolutely.
And of course, we know a lot of these things to not be true today, or to be stretches of the truth. So, okay. Well, so then let's get into this now, because this is a deep subject. I'll leave it to you guys. Lewis, why don't you go ahead and start us off, and then you guys just let it flow. Let it flow. Don't be afraid to step on each other's toes.
Well, Mary, the lawyer, is going to tell us how this is set up.
Okay, so we're going to do that first.
Okay.
Okay, do that first then. Go ahead, Mary.
Because this didn't start.
Okay, and I will.
Got it.
I will save you all the constitutional analysis. We're all a little bit tired of constitutional analyses right now, but. There are some at this point in 1861, when the war begins, a lot of these provisions in the Constitution, who has war powers, are untested. Also, the point of this committee as an congressional oversight committee is also something that, while we're familiar with and understand today, these are the very beginnings of that process. Only a couple of very narrow oversight committees had ever been formed since the Constitution up to 1861. So there's a lot of kind of pushing and pulling that goes on here, especially at the beginning. So we all know the war begins 1861, and the way congressional elections worked back then, some of the elections for Congress had not even been held, even though Lincoln is elected, November of 1860, many of the congressional elections for that next session don't happen until the summer of 1861. And so we've got a Congress that isn't fully formed yet and not scheduled to be in session until December of 1861. Mm-hmm. And so we've got this vacuum with Lincoln in charge as, quote, commander-in-chief, but of course nobody knows what that means, exercising what he will call for the first time the executive's war powers. He actually institutes that phrase, something that we're very familiar with again today, but it all emanates from this. Lincoln's trying to figure out what his authority is. There's nobody in Congress to challenge him. And so at the very beginning, we get this period of about 3 months when it's purely an executive's war. And so we've got Lincoln, who would be considered a moderate Republican back then. We have a bunch of radical Republicans, and we'll see their influence shortly. Radical Republicans see the war as an opportunity to abolish slavery and remake the South. All Lincoln wants to do at this point is put the country back together again, but he's viewed by these radical Republicans and many others as well as an inexperienced executive, which he surely is, and unwilling to vigorously prosecute the war. So Lincoln will take some immediate actions. The first thing he does in April is call a special session of Congress for early July of 1861. But in the interim, he will call up the militia, which he has authority to do. He will expand the size of the Army and Navy, which he clearly does not have the authority to do. And he suspends habeas corpus in some areas. And it's unclear whether he has the authority to do that. There are a couple of other things he does, but those kind of give us the range of things that he's doing. So,
Mary, real quick, for people that are unfamiliar, what does habeas corpus mean?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, habeas corpus is literally show us the body. And it is what it allows Lincoln to do is he suspends habeas corpus, is imprison people, but without charges and without any promise of bringing charges against those people. And he does that in a number of instances. Habeas corpus in this country protects people from that action of imprisonment, but without charges.
So, in other words, show us the body means show us the body of evidence?
Show us the individual.
Okay.
You can't imprison an individual without charges, and habeas corpus means bring us the individual so that we know what the charges are against us.
Gotcha. Okay, so continue.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's perfect. So July and through August of 1861, we have this special session of Congress. We have large Republican majorities in both houses. Most of the Southern Democrats don't attend, and there's general unanimity, much like we had after 9/11. Everybody's on the same page. They're furious at the actions of the South in attacking Fort Sumter. And in this special session, they endorse all of Lincoln's actions, except for that suspension of habeas corpus. And that'll become a cause célèbre through the rest of the war. But we're not going to talk about it again because it doesn't really impact what's happening here.
Okay.
So we have that special session of Congress. Everybody's happy. Everybody's backing Lincoln. Congress goes out of session in August, not due to return until December, and now a perfect storm of events occurs. There's a defeat of the Union Army at Manassas, or Bull Run, if you prefer. There is a defeat at Ball's Bluff, at which Senator Edward Baker, a very close friend of Lincoln's, is killed, and a fellow senator of those in Congress. And out west, John C. Fremont has issued essentially an emancipation proclamation in Missouri. Lincoln fairly quickly undoes the piece of Fremont's order that is emancipation, and all this does is confirm now with these radical Republicans in Congress the ineptitude, first of all, of West Point trained officers, and we'll talk about that in a second, especially McClellan. And it confirms for them Lincoln's unwillingness to embrace emancipation. So they're now kind of on the war path. Now we get a congressional session. They're back in session December of 1861. And the very first piece of legislation that's introduced is a piece of legislation to establish a joint congressional committee to investigate the defeats at Ball's Bluff and Manassas. And over the next 10 days, this very narrow piece of legislation mushrooms into what is a very broad, what's the word I want, endorsement of this joint congressional committee that literally can now investigate anything that has anything to do with the war.
So it was, in other words, it was supposed to be about these very particular battles in the beginning, and then they said, well, we could kind of just like stretch this out forever. Is it basically what you're saying?
I mean, it starts very narrowly, as does much legislation. And then over the next several days, somebody says, well, hey, what about? And, oh, what about this over here? Let's just add this stuff in. Yeah. And pretty soon it becomes this very broad piece of legislation. And it passes both houses of Congress overwhelmingly. And that institutes this committee. We then get members designated for the committee, and it is populated largely by several prominent radical Republicans. These radical Republicans view this committee now as their way to influence the prosecution of the war, that is, to push hard war and emancipation over what they view as this unwillingness of Lincoln to do that. So this is their way to influence the prosecution of the war and to push Lincoln. And we'll see in several instances how they do that. Now, a couple of just real quick things. There is, and it's hard for us to wrap our head around this these days, but at the time, there is a general distrust by radical Republicans, especially in West Point trained officers. They view most of these officers as often traitorous. Most of them are Democrats and not unwilling to indicate their political leanings, largely because Democrats have been in power in Congress in the intervening years before the Civil War, and to get an appointment to West Point, you've got to get somebody in Congress to do it.
Okay.
And so they tend to appoint their own.
Gotcha.
And there's little faith in military training. They believe that West Point doesn't produce fighting men like McClellan. It's viewed as elitist in an era when many believe that the raw talents of the common man are just as valuable as any kind of training. And even during the war, there's several attempts to defund and even abolish West Point. So you have to kind of put that into the hopper and realize that these radical Republicans, even though Lincoln's in their own party, they are fighting a different war than Lincoln is, with different goals. And there's this great distrust of the West Point trained officers. They far prefer those who are not trained at West Point. And we'll see that as we get into the Hooker-Meade hearings, in their willingness to listen to people like Dan Sickles, dare I say, our best friend who comes to light here. He is the epitome to these guys of the common man who is not military trained but is great on the battlefield. And they tend to push over their history these guys that don't have a lot of military training but who are pliable politically. So that's kind of the background. And Lewis, I'll throw it over to you. They'll one of the things that the committee, for instance, does before we get to the Hooker-Meade hearings is push really hard to get McClellan fired. And Lincoln clearly eventually will fire him, but they're pushing Lincoln and they're meeting with Lincoln a number of times to push that view of, we got to get McClellan out. He's not prosecuting the war. and Lincoln will eventually do it, but there'll be enough space between the time a lot of this pushing by the committee happens and the time Lincoln actually fires McClellan that Lincoln will be able to make that his own decision as opposed to something pressured by the committee. But that's the kind of thing they're doing, and they've got tremendous power in these first couple of years of the war.
Okay.
So Louis, I'll throw it over to you to talk a little bit about the Hooker-Meade hearings, what they are, how we get there, and
Okay, that sounds good.
what they're all about.
I'd first like to point out that we always think we are living in the end of times, and what's going on is the worst it's ever been. This is the most important election ever until the next one.
Right.
But today,
Yeah.
any little thing that happens today, they form congressional hearings about.
Yeah.
So this is
Right.
what they do today is nothing new.
So-
they did it back then.
Sure.
And again, as Mary pointed out, this is precipitated by these two disasters early in the war. The loss at First Manassas, where all these civilians come out thinking this is going to be a picnic and we're going to, dust them off and kick them back south.
Right.
And we're going to bring everybody back into the fold. That doesn't go the way they think. And then you have this other disaster at Ball's Bluff, which is about 20 minutes from my house,
Yeah.
where a sitting U.S. senator is killed.
Yeah, is he serving also, or is he just there kind of like watching and cheering
he's in
them
the
on?
military.
Okay, so he's serving as well.
And we may or may not ever see that again. You do have members of Congress in the National Guard or reserves or something.
Yeah.
So
Right.
who knows? But those two things.
And
go ahead, Mary.
yeah, I'm sorry. And even at Manassas, it takes place while Congress is in session in that summer session. And a lot of these guys, including Ben Wade, who becomes one of the most prominent members of this committee, he's one of those guys who takes his carriage out to watch
Yep.
what happens at Manassas and is greatly affected by what he sees there.
I hope. Yeah.
So they come up with this committee, and in 1864, what they're concerned about is not just Meade, but the committee actually starts their investigation from the time Joseph Hooker takes command of the Army of the Potomac, and the period of time that they are covering is from that point in January of 1863 through the end of the Mine Run campaign in late fall of 1863.
Okay.
Now, the part we're talking about today is the Meade hearings, and they go from February 26, 1864 to April 27, 1864. But they don't happen in this vacuum. They're part of a broader investigation, although I think the point of the hearings are to remove Meade. So he's the focus.
Right.
But the focus is sort of expanded into what Hooker was doing when he took command and how things went then also.
And Meade is a Democrat?
Mm.
I can't remember.
I think he's a Democrat.
He's not a radical Republican, that's
Meade is. Meade does not vote for Lincoln or the Democrats in 1860. He votes for I forget the other political party. But he keeps his politics very close to the vest.
Okay.
Although, and his problem is with these committee members that he's not very pliable. And there's some great things in a letter Meade writes in 1862 to his wife about how pliable Hooker is. Essentially, Hooker started the war as sort of ambivalent to abolition, and boy, now he's all for it because it will advance his career.
Okay.
And there's somebody, and Gibbon, I think, actually also writes something to that point, that Hooker is extraordinarily pliable and will do whatever it is that advances his career. And I think here one of the reasons for these kind of back-to-back hearings, Hooker and Meade, is that Lewis is absolutely right. What they want to do is get rid of Meade, but to get rid of Meade, they've got to have a replacement. And
Right.
so the point of the Hooker hearings, because Hooker has been trashed over his leadership at Chancellorsville, and they've got to rehabilitate Hooker. And there have been lots of stories about Hooker being drunk at Chancellorsville. They've got to rehabilitate Hooker in order to have a viable candidate to replace Meade. And that's part of what feeds into this kind of joint goals of Sickles and the radical Republicans, because Sickles wants Hooker back in because Hooker will let Sickles back in to the Army of the Potomac and Meade won't.
You know what?
So there are lots of these things going on. Yeah.
Yeah, and what was so frustrating when I was reading the essays last night was just like, God, nothing has changed. Like,
oh no, that's right.
Like, people
in
are.
case you think it has, yeah.
And this is, I think this is partly why when people want to get into modern day political arguments or discussions with me, I just wave it off, because I just there's nothing new under the sun, and I right. I can see in these essays, I can see the lies that they're telling, and we know them to be lies today. And I go, so I'm just thinking about all the stuff that's happened in just the last year. Let's just say just the last year. And I go, I don't believe anybody anymore, because everybody's got an axe to grind. Everybody's got some kind of agenda. And look at this. Look at this. This is a great example of how Washington politics works and how scummy and sleazy some of these people can be.
I think the biggest difference between now and then is the
television.
Yeah, exactly. The way this is conveyed to the people, either, this is what we want you to believe or not. Today we have cable TV.
Yeah.
And the only good thing about cable TV is TCM. Everything else is trash.
Turner Classic Movies.
I live on that. Without that, I'd wander the streets, homeless, because I'd be so depressed. Back then, it was newspapers. They were doing the same thing, but the audience wasn't as great, and the audience wasn't immediate as TV obviously is today. So the way it's conveyed in the immediacy of it is a lot different, and you can get much more people riled up a lot sooner today.
Oh, immediately.
But you're right. They were lying just as bad back then as they're lying today.
Yeah, they were lying, and you can see that they were lying, for their own purposes. Yep. And I'm talking about the witnesses and the congressmen, It's okay. So anyway,
so Mary mentioned it. She mentioned Senator Benjamin Wade. He's from Ohio. He is essentially the leader of this committee. His right-hand man is Senator Zachariah Chandler, a representative from Michigan. Both of these are radical Republicans. They want, the South destroyed and to pay heavily for their sins, and then we can think about bringing everybody back together. So these two are the ones running the committee. Now, when these various people, these witnesses, come before the committee to testify, the entire committee is not always there. There's different people showing up at different times, just like today. They have other things to do. So keep that in mind.
Okay.
I won't list everybody that's on the committee, but they don't all show up at once. So, again, the portion of the Meade hearings dealing with the Gettysburg campaign and the aftermath all the way through Mine Run begins February 26th with the testimony of Major General Daniel Sickles. Of course, he comes up with the Third Corps. It's interesting that the orders to put Meade in charge arrive on the 28th of June.
Right.
James Hardy, I believe he was a captain at the time, is bringing the orders on the same train as Daniel Sickles.
I think he was a major. Wasn't he a major?
Maybe he could, but major.
Doesn't matter.
James Hardy's the guy.
Yeah.
He's on the train. Dan Sickles is on the same train. So you got when Meade gets the orders, he thinks it's bad news.
Mm-hmm.
It's not terrible news. The bad news is Sickles is on that same train coming to take over his corps. Because it's Sickles' shadow that's going to hound him for the rest of his life from that point on.
Yeah.
So he's the first one that testifies, and he's out, and he did this for the rest of his life too, and he lived a very long time. He lived to be 92 years old. I think he died in 1914. This is what he tells from that point on, when he's removed from the battlefield till he dies. He tells the same story. Mm-hmm. Essentially, his corps saved the Battle of Gettysburg. during the testimony, he says that his left occupied Little Round Top. We know it didn't. But the big thing, as far as the testimony goes, the big whopper he tells, and this is based off hearsay, is that Meade wants to retreat on the morning of July 2nd.
Right.
Now, Meade doesn't come up with the Army immediately. We know that the 1st Corps and the 11th Corps engaged the Confederates northwest of town. Meade is going to send up Major General Hancock to figure out what's going on and to send back some reports to say, is this essentially a good place to fight, and can we move the whole army up? Because Meade has that contingency plan, the Pipe Creek plan, to fall back on.
Right. Which, by the way, maybe we'll get to this later, but in case we don't, Doubleday in the committee, he says that he couldn't understand for the life of him why Meade wouldn't be up there. When he's down at Tawnytown, he can hear the firing, and he sends Hancock instead. And that right there was just like, well, you obviously were never in command of an army, where the whole army isn't up. Meade's not behind the army; he's in the middle of the army when he's at Tawnytown.
Yeah, and you have to.
Right.
When you're the commander, you're not just looking out for what's going on at a certain point. You've also got to look, is this where we want to fight? Where's the rest of the army? And if I go there and get caught up in that, I'm not looking around to see what's going on in the periphery either.
Right.
To understand, do we need to? You're the brain
Right.
of the organization.
Right.
The brain doesn't go where the hand goes all the time.
No, it tells the hand where to go. Yeah.
Exactly, and that's what.
Right, and certainly, if Meade moves too far, then nobody knows how to get in touch with Meade.
Yeah.
Nobody knows where he
Right.
is, and communication is difficult enough.
And
without Meade moving around all the time, and at least initially, he's got Reynolds up there. Now
Right.
he'll find out
It's
fairly
not- yeah.
quickly that he doesn't anymore, and that's what precipitates sending Hancock up. But he thinks things initially are well in hand because Reynolds is there. He won't find out until, I don't know, Lewis, maybe noon.
Yeah, somewhere around midday.
That
I think it
Reynolds is
late
dead?
morning.
Yeah.
Midday, yeah.
Yeah.
And remarkably, Sickles would testify, and I'll quote this: I addressed a written communication to General Meade, begging him by all means to concentrate his army there at Gettysburg and fight a battle. So we have Sickles to thank that we're even at Gettysburg.
Right.
Even to this day.
Yes.
He
Yes.
tells Meade, you need to send the army there.
Yeah, I remember when I read that, I was like, that is pretty audacious. Like,
And how does he know that? He said, stating that in my judgment, it was a good place to fight, and that the position of General Howard was an admirably chosen one.
yeah.
And the benefit as these guys testify, what they're literally asked these open-ended questions like, well, tell us about what happened at Gettysburg. And some of them have, and there's literally no cross-examination for these early witnesses. As Lewis pointed out, Wade and sometimes Chandler are the only committee members present. And they're aligned with Sickles. They have no interest in protecting Meade or defending Meade's actions. So a couple of important things to remember. First of all, these are open-ended questions which allow people like Sickles to just talk about whatever they'd like to talk about. And second, some of these guys have not filed any reports. And so even later, there's nothing to judge their testimony against. And so Sickles makes these outlandish statements when, if you look at his testimony and then you look at the actual message he sent to Meade, they're barely the same thing. This whole idea of having, I told Meade to send the army up. Well, I defy you to find in Sickles' message back to Meade anything like that. So he's just kind of talking and making up stories, which is true throughout his testimony. So I think that, as we think about testimony today and this questioning and answering, that's not what's going on here.
Right.
The committee has set its own rules. And so these guys literally are just telling their stories. And that's true for Meade, as he testifies as well, at least the first time. But it's certainly true of Sickles and Doubleday. They just get to tell their story without any interruption and without any cross-examination, essentially. And so they're free to tell whatever they want to tell. Also, the committee has said that all the testimony that's provided to them is provided in secret and may not be disclosed. So witnesses can't talk to each other. The testimony is taken and written down, which is what we have today in these reports. But it's a very different atmosphere than what we see today in these kind of public congressional hearings.
Right, there's no C-SPAN.
There's no C-SPAN, and I mean these are like those Schiff hearings in the basement that everybody went nuts about.
Right.
Last year,
yeah.
They're in the basement and they're all being done out of public. Well, that's what these hearings were like.
Okay,
exactly what these hearings were like.
Yeah.
Okay,
but of course they ignore the, witnesses not speaking to each other.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, how are they going to stop that?
They clearly, they clearly do
because they don't like me.
Right.
And they clearly do, and there's even early on in the committee rules something that a rule that says the committee members can't disclose what goes on in the hearings until about 1862, when they decide, leaking can be really effective. So it's okay for us to leak whatever we want to. And so that kind of changes things too. And clearly Wade and Chandler are leaking. Just a couple of other quick things. There's also some history here between Meade and Zachariah Chandler. Mm-hmm. Meade, at the beginning of the war in 1861, is in charge of the mapping of the Great Lakes, and he's located in Detroit. Zachariah Chandler, who's the other powerful radical Republican on this committee, is from Michigan and a really big deal in Michigan. And at the very beginning of the war, right after the attack on Fort Sumter, Zachariah Chandler in Detroit brings everybody out to a public meeting and wants all citizens, including the military, to take a loyalty oath to the United States. And Meade tells his military guys, we've already taken an oath. We don't need to take another public oath. We're not participating. Mm-hmm. And that will stick in Zachariah Chandler's craw the rest of the war. And so he's kind of got this thing about Meade as well as a non-loyal West Point guy. You can't trust him. The other thing that happens when Sickles testifies is that he introduces into evidence, because it seems fairly clear, Lewis, I don't know if you agree with this or not, that most of these, that Wade and Chandler either don't have access to or have not bothered to read the official reports or any of the other official documents of the Army of the Potomac before they begin these hearings.
Yeah, and
would you agree with that?
I think so, and because at one point when Meade comes back, he introduces his own stuff, his own orders that become part of the official reports, and he asks at one point, "Can we make this part of the evidence?" It doesn't matter to them, but he's the one that brings it. Meade does, and Meade's going to testify twice. Let me backtrack a little bit because we're talking about. We mentioned they just want to get rid of Meade. Well, how are they going to do that? So the charges they bring against him is Meade did not want to fight at Gettysburg. And once the fight began on July 1st, he wanted to retreat. Mm-hmm. And he orders a retreat on July, or he prepares for a retreat on the morning of July 2nd. Meade failed to pursue the Confederates in a timely manner, thereby missing an opportunity to destroying the Army of Northern Virginia. Meade failed to attack the Confederates once they were backed up on the Potomac River. And lastly, Meade is just not fit to be the commander of the Army of the Potomac.
Just not fit.
That's the bottom line. So getting back to Sickles, he's the one that first brings up the issue of retreating on the morning of July 2nd. Now, he gets this, and this is where you see some collusion from Daniel Butterfield, the chief of staff that Meade inherited from Hooker. On the morning of July 2nd, Meade goes to Butterfield and says, "Hey, I need you to get," and I'm paraphrasing everything, obviously, "I need you to get reports from all the Corps commanders about the road network around their forces. Yeah. And that's a good thing for a commander to do, because if things don't go well,
right,
you got to know where the roads are if you do have to retreat.
Sure.
In this case, go back to Pipe Creek, I guess. So Butterfield's going to take this as a meaning that Meade wants to know where all these roads are, because he's about to pull the army out and head south.
But is Butterfield really taking it that way, or is he spinning it that way?
He's spinning it that way, unless he's just an
Unless
idiot.
he's an idiot.
Yeah.
But he was chief of staff before. It wasn't like he just came up with Meade. He was there before Meade.
Yeah,
he had
he's
more
one of Hooker's
experience.
guys.
Yes.
And so, Meade offered the chief of staff to somebody else, and I believe it was Andrew Humphreys of the 3rd Corps.
Yes.
And Humphrey said, no, this fight's going to happen. I want to be with my men, and we'll talk about it after this battle. So he retains Butterfield. While this is in Butterfield's mind, while this is happening, Meade is getting his commanders to bring him information. Is it feasible to attack on the right side of the Union line? And that would be Cemetery Hill over towards Culp's Hill. So he's in Meade's mind, he's thinking, maybe we can attack on the morning of July 2nd. Butterfield's telling the committee later on, and Sickles is starting it off by saying Meade wants to retreat on the morning of July 2nd, because he's telling me to get all the Corps commanders to explain where the roads are heading south.
Let me ask you a question here, both of you. Before Meade, you got Hooker, you got Burnside, McClellan. Was it their styles? Anybody in command of the Army of the Potomac before Meade, was it their style to get a consensus and seek guidance and counsel from their subordinates, or would they just make up their own minds? Or do you know what I mean? Like, in other words, is Meade in this style? Is he something new that the Army of the Potomac is not used to?
I don't
Do
know.
you know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah. Because that is a big thing with Meade, and it comes out. He's always having these councils of war.
Which to me sounds smart. It sounds like something that you should do.
In his case, I give him a pass for it. I prefer a more decisive leader, and I'm a big Meade fan. Let me point that out. Despite the Robert E. Lee tags I got on my car, I like Meade. I was a first sergeant for 18 months down at Fort Meade. But he's brand new to command.
Yes.
And he's done well to get to this point.
Right.
And then through the battle, he's trying to figure out what they should do. And when he takes command on the 28th, I don't think he's prepared for it.
Who could be?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, and I think to your point, Matt, one of the things that Meade and other senior commanders in the Army of the Potomac complain about under Hooker is that he doesn't keep his commanders in the loop.
That's my point.
And so they have an immediate, kind of an immediate example before them, or Meade does, of Hooker not keeping these folks, not keeping his senior commanders. I think, and Lewis, correct me if I'm wrong, that Meade will later say that when he meets with Hooker, when Meade receives his orders to take command, he hasn't seen Hooker for something like 2 to 3 weeks.
Yeah.
And so there is this vacuum that Meade now fills, and he does it in his mind. Well, as a senior commander, I wasn't kept in the loop, and that's made things difficult for me.
Right.
I'm gonna do it differently.
And I think those commanders that he's asking have a lot of experience, and he knows them, like Hancock and Sedgwick. Reynolds is dead. Howard, Slocum.
Right.
So they are experienced Corps commanders. They are his peers.
And he seems to me to possess the qualities of a leader. Like he's, a leader is going to get a consensus and then decide what to do. He's not going to just start deciding things.
Yeah, the only drawback I would say with all this is, what is Meade's honest opinion? Without asking anybody else, because what you want to do is, all right, this is what I think we should do. Tell me why it's a good idea or not a good idea. Right. And if the bad outweighs, if people make rational arguments why this isn't a good idea, and then you can go to that side. But if after all that you still think it's a good idea, you need to go.
Well, sometimes when I'm trying to make a decision with, this tremendous undertaking of addressing Gettysburg, and I seek the counsel of people around me, I don't necessarily tell them what I'm thinking because I want an honest answer.
Yeah.
And if I tell them what I'm thinking, then if they're a people pleaser and a yes man, they're going to tell me why I'm right. And if they're a person who really has like a deep resentment for me, like Veronica does. No, I'm just kidding, Veronica.
I can see that.
Is, like a deep resentment for me and secretly wants to help me fail, because you do have those people around you sometimes, then they're going to tell me why it's not a good idea when they know it probably is. So I would rather not tip my hand, and I would rather just say, what do you think?
Yeah.
Without any indication as to what I think, because I want your honest opinion, and then I know what I'm thinking.
Yeah.
And I'll make the decision based on what you're saying to me. So I don't know. I mean, that's
he doesn't have to tell him what he's thinking. And in the future, just ask me. Think long, think wrong.
Right. There you go. But I think too. I mean, my impression, and it is an impression of that meeting, since we have so little to go on, of that War Council the night of the 2nd. Is that Meade's doing as much or more listening than he is talking. He's listening to the discussions of his corps commanders. He wants to understand the condition of his men, the morale of his men, because he has spent most of his time at headquarters. He needs to understand on a first-person basis what the condition is, because that's going to inform what he decides to do. And so I think he's trying to use this also as a way to take in information, believing perhaps that his corps commanders will be brutally honest as they talk to each other, and perhaps less honest when they or less informative when they talk to him. Just kind of an impression, but I think he's using this as a leadership technique to kind of listen to what's going on around him. It's not. I think he knows what he wants to do, but he's willing to have his mind changed if he hears something that causes him a problem.
Yeah. Again, which I think is the sign of a good leader.
Yeah.
I agree. And like Lewis, I will admit to being a big Meade fan. I think the things he does here is amazing.
The more I learn about him, the more I'm a fan and a defender.
Yeah. Absolutely.
What brings me to the point where these witnesses were colluding, specifically Sickles with Butterfield, as Sickles would testify, and this is a quote, "I have reason to know that Meade's plan of operations was changed again on Thursday, July 2nd, and that he resumed in substance the plan that he had on Wednesday morning, which was to fall back to Pipe Creek or to someplace in that neighborhood." I think Sickles gets this from the Butterfield, talking about Meade comes to me, wants me to know where all the roads are from the corps commanders, and Butterfield, of course, spins that tale that Meade wants this information because he wants to know how to retreat.
Yeah,
and I would actually put an additional spin on that, which is that when Sickles comes before the committee, he will introduce portions of the Pipe Creek Circular. And he introduces those portions of the Pipe Creek Circular that make it look like it is a retreat order, that make it look like it's a pull back to Pipe Creek. I don't care where you are, everybody come back to Pipe Creek. We all know when you look at the entire Pipe Creek Circular that there are a number of places where he says, unless circumstances change or subject to changes in circumstances.
Right.
He does that a number of times, but when Sickles introduces the, quote, Pipe Creek Circular, he never includes those provisions. And so the committee never sees the full Pipe Creek Circular until Meade testifies the second time, and he brings that circular with him.
Aha. So, and he's allowed to enter that into evidence, right?
Yeah. So that's part of the documents Lewis said he brings in to enter into evidence. And so up until that time, and this goes back to, I don't think the members of the committee have looked at any of these records. And so that allows Sickles to come in and put in this partial Pipe Creek Circular, which allows him to slant things the way he wants to. And I think he uses that as well in this kind of inference that Meade reverted back to the orders on July 1st, the Pike Creek Circular, as Sickles has presented it to the committee, which he presents as a retreat order.
When Meade shows up to testify, he's sort of testifying blind.
Yes.
It reads, as I've read about it, he's just happens to be in D.C., and he hears all this hubbub surrounding Sickles and Butterfield in this committee. And so they offer him a chance to go testify.
Oh, wait a second. He wasn't summoned there?
Summoned, no.
So he just happened to be there, and he heard that they were talking about
him.
him.
He's in town, and hey, you hear what's going on with you? No, what? Wow, they're over at the Capitol talking about you.
Wow.
Yeah.
And remember that, I mean, Doubleday doesn't have a command. Sickles doesn't have a command. Howe at this point has been reorganized down to Washington, D.C., so he's off the battlefield. They're all available and working and kind of working toward this, let's help everybody get rid of Meade. George Meade is in the middle of a reorganization of the Army of the Potomac. And the reason that he's busy, and the reason he goes to Washington is to discuss with Halleck this reorganization of the Army of the Potomac. And that's when, as Lewis said, he's hearing these, their grave charges. He'll write to his wife certain grave charges about me. And goes up to, let me see if I can find the quote here. He goes up to Wade and Wade says, hey, well, while you're in town, why don't you come in darn it, I'm going to find this.
It's Wade's sort of telling him we're going to write a history of the battle.
Oh, yeah.
I need you to put your part
Wade is sort of, oh, hey, no big deal. Just why don't you come in and tell your story?
Right.
And so Meade says, and assures Meade that there is no attempt here to remove Meade. And even Halleck will tell him, don't worry about this. This is all silliness. And so Meade goes in. He's not been able to review his papers. He has no idea what others have said other than these rumors he's hearing in Washington. And he sits down and literally gets the question, hey, so tell us what happened to Gettysburg.
Right.
And Meade.
And then afterwards they say, is there anything else you'd like to add? And he said, I'm sure I'd have a lot to add if I knew what you've been saying about me.
And Meade writes his wife at one point saying, I've got some friends on the committee, and I think Senator Wade's one of them.
Right, exactly,
so
exactly.
And is problem with reading people.
Yeah, he doesn't sound like he's very good with that.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. So you were mentioning. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No. I was going to say you were mentioning before Doubleday and Howe and everything like that. Howe, he was removed just like a couple of days before.
Part of the reorg, yeah.
Part of the reorganization. So was that a sting that he held against Meade? Did he get along with Meade prior to that? I mean, he's a division commander, so would he have had that much doings with Meade directly prior, like when he was in the Army?
Yeah, I don't know of any particular history the two have, but he clearly is upset because he's being taken off the field, which is where all these guys want to be, and placed in a kind of administrative role. And I forget exactly what it was. I can find it here. Hang on.
While she's looking for that, that brings us to the next two witnesses. So you had Sickles, he's the first big one. Yeah. And then you have Major General Doubleday and Brigadier General Albion Howe. Now, they're both, at different points, they've both been relieved. Doubleday famously after the first day's fight, where he does a credible job. I don't know what else he could have done as things are falling apart in west of town. But then he's relieved, and he's bitter. He's bitter about that. He would write, Doubleday would tell the committee that General Meade thought a couple of scapegoats were necessary, meaning on the first day's fight, in case the next day's battle turned out unfavorably. He wished to mark his disapprobation of the first day's fight. General Meade is in the habit of violating the organic law of the Army to place his personal friends in power. There has always been a great deal of favoritism in the Army of the Potomac. So Doubleday tells the committee that the reason Meade doesn't rush up to Gettysburg when the battle starts is because if things don't go well, he doesn't want to be on the field. That sort of sounds like another Corps commander that they asked to come up Slocum. He says, well, no.
Yeah.
I got my own people to tend to.
Yeah.
We'll see how it turns out. But that's what Doubleday's saying about Meade. He didn't rush up to the first day's field because if things don't go well, he wants to blame it on somebody else, which is ludicrous. We've spoke about why he stays down in Taneytown.
Yes.
Instead of moving up.
Right.
I think he did a good job there.
Well, and another thing that Doubleday says here, he says, I think there have always been pro-slavery cliques controlling that army, composed of men who, in my opinion, would not have been unwilling to make a compromise in favor of slavery and who desired to have nobody put in authority except those who agreed with them on that subject. So it sounds like a little, as we would call today, dog whistle.
Yes.
Right? It's a little dog whistle to the radical Republicans.
Yeah, and Howe and Doubleday are similar in what they testify about. Now, Howe is the first one to testify that was with the Army during the retreat. The previous two witnesses left the Army before the retreat. So he gets into the retreat, but towards the end of his testimony, he calls Meade a copperhead.
Yes.
Which is those Democrats in the North that are sort of pro-South, sort of pro-slavery, and want this thing to end.
Yeah.
And if the country's cut in half, so be it. And that's a very derogatory thing to say about a commander or anybody up north that is for union and for ending slavery.
So the Meade was a Democrat?
Well, I don't know.
Or
No.
Copperheads,
I don't.
just call just a derogatory term.
It was just a slur.
Right.
Yeah, but that's what copperheads were generally known as.
Yes. Okay. Gotcha.
And that's what Howe calls Meade. At one point, getting back to Doubleday, he talks about how good the Army was in during the retreat. And he says, our troops for 2 days during the battle have been lying down a great deal in a defensive position. And this is going to come up later and actually makes it into the final report that's not issued till after the war, that they say, these 3 days were pretty much 3 days of rest for the Union Army. They didn't really exert themselves too much.
Yeah.
And there's no reason why they couldn't have chased down the Confederates and taken them out.
It's amazing to me when I read that part about how they're basically just like sitting on a hill, hiding behind walls.
Yeah, it's shady. We got a lot of water.
Yeah, and I'm thinking to myself, like, I don't know what I thought to myself. I was just astonished that these people would do that. Like the people that you'll throw under the bus or under the coach, I guess, as it were back then. For your own political gain and purpose, like it just astounds me how people can be.
And a lot of them will, when they're testifying, they'll indicate that anybody could have been in that position that the Union Army occupied and beat back the Confederates. It didn't take great generalship to do that. The terrain sort of dictated things. Now, the terrain provided
the battle for us.
It provided a big advantage, but you've got to know enough to take advantage of the terrain. It's not just to have the terrain. What are you going to do with it?
Yeah.
And the way that the Union Army moves up, thanks to Meade sending Hancock, somebody who gets everything in order, to set it up to then reinforce that position. I mean, that's leadership.
Yes.
You can't just have a hill and, we'll let the hill do the work.
Right.
Yeah, but the big thing, we have these three witnesses come. It's before Howe's testimony ends that Chandler and Wade, the two senators that are in charge of this committee, they draft a note, they send it to the White House, and in their view, the Army of the Potomac needs a new commander, and they believe Meade needs to be removed. They say, we like Hooker. We think Hooker should come back and be in charge. But whoever you want to be in charge is fine with us, not name Meade. So we've got three people testifying so far, all anti-Meade. A lot of their claims are very dubious. And then these two members of this committee, the leaders of this committee, send over to the White House demanding that General Meade he hadn't testified yet, be removed from command. And probably Hooker should be placed back in charge.
I always thought it was weird to people picking their own boss. That's like picking the detective who's going to investigate you.
Yeah.
Like I don't know. It's just we like Hooker. Yeah, because why? Why do you like Hooker? Why did you like McClellan?
Yeah,
because he didn't use you.
Right.
That's why.
Well, and remember, they've had experience at this point. They would say, I think these committee members would say, in pushing Lincoln to get rid of McClellan.
Yeah.
So they now believe they are in a position to influence Lincoln to get rid of Meade, go back to Hooker, because they think they're pushing this. One of the questions that I find interesting is, why is it after 3 witnesses, all of whom clearly are stacked to be against Meade, why do they suddenly go to Lincoln? Why don't they wait for this to play out some?
Because
and the answer, and I think what I certainly think is that what happens in the meantime here is that these guys are all in Congress, and Congress has just voted to reestablish the rank of lieutenant general, and that will bring Grant to Washington and place him in command of all of these armies. Grant has an unassailable reputation, and these committee members are smart enough and politic enough to know they can't go up against Grant. And so I think one of the driving forces here for this, and they do eventually meet with Lincoln that night. One of the reasons they do that is because they know the clock is ticking. They're not going to have much longer to be able to influence the command of these armies, because they are unwilling and probably unable to go up against Grant. And so they have a shortened time frame, and I think that's a large amount of what influences their decision to, okay, now we've heard enough. We've heard these 3 people. They testified to every one of these 5 charges against Meade. And so now we're going to go to Lincoln and say, hey, this is the lay of the land. This guy's got to go. Because within just a couple of days, they're going to be unable to make that case to Lincoln. They would have to go to Grant, and they're not willing to do that.
Okay.
So I think that's another thing that causes this kind of immediate, let's get rid of Meade. And then Lincoln very properly will say, well, thanks very much, like Lincoln often does, right?
Mm-hmm.
Thanks very much. Let me think about it. And then they go back to work and they start interviewing more people.
So,
and then,
yeah.
Yep.
No, go ahead. And then?
And then, so Meade testifies without preparation. And then, Lewis, you want to talk about that first Historicus letter that appears?
Oh, yes. So, and that goes to one of the questions.
Yeah, let me get to the question here. I'll ask the question so that we can. Where is the Historicus question? Where is it?
Well, it was about newspapers.
Oh no! Oh yeah. Okay.
News.
Yeah.
All right. Here it is, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, this is from Steve Byers. He says Meade gets roasted by Sickles, Butterfield, Doubleday et al. I also know that Meade's relationship with the media was bad as well. Did any media have his back and push back on the fake news coming from Sickles? All the best, Steve. Mary, you want to take that while Lewis is looking through his notes?
Yeah, as Lewis looks through that, let me talk a little bit about how some of the congressional debates enter into, not at the committee level, but within Congress. We end up with some congressmen saying some very bad things about General Meade right in the middle of all of this. And of course, all of these debates in Congress get reported by the newspapers. But there's another radical Republican, Senator Morton Wilkinson of Minnesota, who will continue to work for Meade's removal even into late 1864. But he'll condemn Meade by saying in Congress, I am told and I believe it can be proven that before the fight commenced at Gettysburg, the order went forth from the commander of that army to retreat. And but for the single fact that one of the corps commanders had got it in a fight before the dispatch reached him, i.e. Dan Sickles, the whole army would undoubtedly have been retreating. So that's the kind of stuff that's going on the floor of Congress. And then we get Senator Rebutting Johnson, who will begin to leak now what comes out of this committee and give a spirited defense of Meade on the floor of the Senate.
And he's a
and
Democrat.
So you've got all of that going on, and that's all getting reported in the newspapers. So there is a lot of stuff out there, but again, very partisan. You know, as we started talking about this, it's like, well, who do you believe?
Yeah.
And this all comes out again, very partisan, but it's happening on the floor of the Senate and the House as well, and being reflected in the newspaper. So that's out there, along with Lewis. You ready with Historicus?
Yes. And one side note
Good
about
segue.
the Reverend Perfidy Johnson, he would later act as counsel for Mary Surratt.
Oh, yeah. That's right.
Yeah. So he's from Maryland. Mm-hmm. So during this, before Historicus comes out, and Historicus is the name of an anonymous, not so anonymous writer who sent an article to the New York Herald on it was published March 12th, 1864. Even before that, on March 7th, in the New York Tribune, there is an article written about the investigating committee and the points that are made against Meade. And at one point in the article, it says they're talking about after the battle and the Confederate Army is going to retreat from Gettysburg, about this issue of pursuing them in a timely manner. The article states that for a few moments he yielded to persuasions, Meade that is, to let the Third Corps pursue, but countermanded the order to do so in 10 minutes after it was given, saying, alluding to the rebels, "Oh, let them go. We'll catch up with them sooner or later. Just let them go.
They've had a rough day.
Yeah.
Let them go."
But this Historicus letter, again, it was written to the New York Herald. Most people believe, probably rightly, although it's not 100%, that it's Daniel Sickles who wrote this article. Again, it was published March 12th, 1864, and it states it's an important communication from an eyewitness, how the victory was won and how its advantages were lost. General Halleck's and Meade's official reports refuted. And essentially, this article, and this is why people believe Sickles wrote it, explains how the Third Corps saved the day at Gettysburg, despite everything that Meade did to throw the victory away. It even, it calls the Third Corps commander, Sickles, a valiant commander. There's all these superlatives associated with the Third Corps commander. And it's not only anti-Meade, but this sparks an argument between members of the Third Corps, or Sickles, and members of the Fifth Corps. Because when Sickles pushes his line out, Meade goes out there to talk to Sickles. He says you can call from the Artillery Reserve and from the Fifth Corps for support, because Meade probably knows they're not going to last out there on Emmitsburg Road. But when they go to call for support, the commander, I think it's General Barnes, he's the one that writes the rebuttal, that they went back, hey, can we get somebody from loan us a brigade or division? And the response is, well, my men are making coffee. Once all that's done, we'll be right up.
Right.
You'll have no problems until then. Yeah. And that's what's written in here.
Yeah. So it's the second day of the battle.
Yes.
Birney's division's holding left of Sickles' line, and he requests assistance from the Fifth Corps. And that's the answer that he gets.
We're making coffee, specifically making coffee.
Right, right. But this is even before the Confederates attack. He's anticipating, hey, they're going to hit us hard on the left and they can overlap us, so help us. They go, after coffee. And you know what? People are still like that today.
They got to have their coffee.
I can't do anything until I have my morning coffee.
I understand.
So,
in this article, it's written that near this important ground was posted the valiant Third Corps and its commander, General Sickles, who saw at once how necessarily it was to occupy the elevated ground in his front towards the Emmitsburg Road and to extend his lines to the commanding eminence known as Round Top or Sugarloaf Hill, Little Round Top. Mm-hmm. So Sickles saw this. We not only have to occupy that area we know today as the Peach Orchard, we also got to occupy our left on Little Round Top. And
even
Sickles
though I was already there.
Sickles is going to do that.
Yeah.
He testified that he was there. So does Bernie. They must have been there.
He was.
Yeah.
In part.
Yeah. He writes, 2 p.m. came and yet no orders. Why is this? Other orders than those expected by General Sickles were, it appears, in preparation at headquarters. It has since been stated upon unquestionable authority that General Meade had decided upon a retreat and that an order to withdraw from the position held by our enemy was penned by his Chief of Staff, General Butterfield, though happily its promulgation never took place. Again, it's back to, this is at 2 p.m. So who's spinning this tale in front of the committee that they want to retreat? It's Sickles. Butterfield hasn't testified yet at this point. So this goes back to Sickles wrote this. It's all part of, now we're part of persuading, we're doing what cable news does today.
Yes.
We're trying to form public opinion, and that's what some newspapers did when they're printing stuff like this. But like I said, and I won't read too much of this mess, this didn't sit well with everybody, and I'm not talking about Meade. General Barnes, a division commander in the 5th Corps, is going to write a rebuttal basically saying, no, we were ready to support you, and we weren't waiting to have our coffee made. You're making the 5th Corps look bad at the expense of us. So he's going to reply on March 18th, 1864. He says, in your paper of the 20th instant, Historicus favors the world with an immense letter on the Battle of Gettysburg. It is so manifestly intended to create public opinion that few will attach to it the importance the writer hopes. I wish to correct some of his misstatements, and having been an eyewitness, claimed that to be both heard and believed. So he goes through this list of 7 different things, and I'll just read the 7th. And this is simply a staff officer with the 5th Corps. When a dispassionate writer seats himself to bolster up one officer at the expense of others, neither hearsay evidence nor slight errors should have a place in his narrative. Unadulterated truth should stamp its every assertion. So he's doing what we do today. This is just a bunch of stuff intended to elevate the 3rd Corps and Sickles above everybody else. And this is what Sickles spent the rest of his life doing.
I was going to say, people today always complain about the cowardice of people who hide behind an alias online and say nasty and horrible things. It's like, but that's not a creation of social media. It's been going on ever since there was printed media. People hide. I mean, Ben Franklin was like probably the most successful troll ever. Yeah. Let's just take a pause right there, Eric. We'll take a quick break, and we'll come right back and continue with this. This is very fascinating. We'll be right back, everybody.
Tell you what, this might come in handy if the lockdowns continue throughout the winter. Plowman Cider is a proud sponsor of Addressing Gettysburg and wants to offer our listeners the chance to bring Adams County's delicious agricultural countryside to the comfort of your own home this winter. Grown and fermented on Plowman's 7th-generation family farm, their heirloom and bittersweet apple varieties create ciders that would have been familiar to our ancestors, but will be new to your modern taste buds. You can get Plowman Cider on Gettysburg's historic Lincoln Square at their tap room, or have it shipped to your home by visiting plowmancider.com. Addressing Gettysburg listeners can use the coupon code CIDERPOD at checkout to enjoy 15% off your order. So put a taste of Adams County in your glass this winter with Plowman Cider. Go to plowmancider.com and use promo code CIDERPOD for 15% off. That's plowghmancider.com. You must be 21 years of age, and shipping is subject to your state's regulations.
Do you have a local business in Gettysburg? Do you want to reach people who are itching to visit us, but don't know exactly where to stay, where to eat, or what to do while they're here? Well, then you should consider advertising on Addressing Gettysburg. You can reach thousands of Gettysburg enthusiasts per month who are within a 4 to 8 hour drive of us, as well as all over the world. Reach them where they are before they're already in town. This is the more affordable and more 21st century way to advertise. So contact us at advertise@addressinggettysburg.com for more information. That's advertise@addressinggettysburg.com.
Okay, we are back, and go ahead, Louis. You had a little bit more there to continue.
Yeah,
with.
I just wanted to add a quote that Meade's going to write to his wife when he goes to testify. And again, he thinks, these people are friendly. Wade tells him that we're just going to do this history of the battle. We want to get your input. Clearly, you were in charge there, and that's what we're trying to do. Meade is going to write to his wife, though. He says, and I quote, "The only evil that result is the spreading over the country certain mysterious whisperings of dreadful deficiencies on my part, the truth concerning which will never reach the thousandth part of those who hear the lies." And I think this is true today. A lot of people read into this and, they don't see it for what it was, and they don't think Meade did a great job, and they think he was horrible, and, he should have destroyed Lee. I'm sure Lee would have had something to do with that.
Sure. Just sit there.
Yeah, so they consider him a failure, and he's writing back then, 1864, Meade's writing to his wife saying, that's what's going to come from this. This is the only bad thing, because I'm not going to get removed. In time, Lincoln's going to assure him that, no, you're fine. And he's the last commander of the Army of the Potomac. But he rightly states the evil that's going to come through this is certain misperceptions about deficiencies in my leadership.
Yeah, and you know what's funny is when I first started coming down here and getting into the battle and everything, and with my dad, we would take tours, and he would always go, "I don't understand. Why didn't he chase him? Why didn't he chase him down and just finish it all? I don't get it. Why didn't he do that?" And I didn't know the answer to that then. And I didn't even have a clue as to where to start and everything. But I just knew, in my gut, his reaction didn't sit well with me. I was just like, no, it just makes sense to me. I don't know why, on a guttural level.
Yeah.
And then as I started learning about it, I said, okay, Dad, your annual question that you would ask when we would come here, why didn't Meade chase him? And I would give him all these reasons, and he would still be like, yeah, but come on. And I don't know. Meade gets such a bad rap, and even people that don't know anything about it, instinctively just have this horrible Monday morning quarterbacking reaction to it. And I just wish people would just imagine for 1 minute you're walking in someone else's shoes. Try to think about what you don't know about running an army.
Before we get to Mary, speaking of this, why he doesn't do these things. This is written to his wife from Frederick on July 8th, 1863. So the army has moved away from Gettysburg. They're in pursuit.
Okay.
Meade's going to write, "From the time I took command till today, now over 10 days, I have not changed my clothes, have not had a regular night's rest, and many nights not a wink of sleep, and for several days did not even wash my hands, face and hands, no regular food, and all the time in a great deal of mental anxiety. Indeed, I think I have lived as much in this time as in the last 30 years." He was wore out.
Yeah, but come on.
That's all I got for you, George.
Wait, isn't that his job,
Yeah, right. He knew what he was getting into when he took that job.
This is the thing, and I've stayed up. I think I made it to 37 hours doing intense work, and I was a zombie. And I had to drive home, and that was pretty dangerous. So your thinking starts to go south. Yeah. After 12 hours of strenuous activity, you're not thinking clearly. And back then, I think it was a little worse because you don't have food and water and the things we use to prep ourselves up.
You know who the people are that criticize Meade for not being a Superman, withstanding all this stuff? The very same people that say, "Not until I've had my morning coffee."
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, that's right.
Exactly.
That's right.
All right, so go ahead, Mary. Now, what's Meade's reaction to Historicus?
Yeah, so Meade does a couple of things immediately. The first thing after he reads this, and clearly is incensed about it, writes to the War Department and requests an inquiry into the identity of Historicus. And then he's urged by Halleck and eventually by Lincoln himself, don't start a public feud. Meade seems to clearly understand that Sickles has written this, or certainly believes it, and he's told, that's not where we need to be right now. Remember the time frame here. We're in March of 1864. We're reorganizing the Army of the Potomac and getting ready for that overland campaign. This is not the time to start a fight over what's going on or what has gone on in the Army of the Potomac. And I think partially recognizing Sickles' political influence. And then on March 15th, Meade writes to his brother-in-law the following, as part of a letter, the following. My enemies consist of certain politicians who wish me removed to restore Hooker. Then of certain subordinates whose military reputations are involved in the destruction of mine. Finally, a class of vultures who in Hooker's day preyed upon the Army and who sigh for a return to those glorious days. I expect to retain my place, but I'm anxious about my reputation. And rightfully so. And I reflect that as people come to Gettysburg, there's still an awful lot of people who think that he was removed after this campaign and Grant takes over. There are, and so clearly his reputation is sullied by all of this. And it's taken a long time and still continues to be rehabilitated, I think, today.
Yeah.
And there are an awful lot of people. I know when I ask, because I do some of these groups, who's in charge of the Confederate Army? Oh, everybody knows it's Robert E. Lee. Well, who's in charge of the Union Army?
Grant.
And you get a lot of blank stares.
Yeah.
So poor George Meade has been lost to history a little bit. And I think a lot of that comes not only from, it comes as germs from these hearings where he's so thoroughly destroyed. And then and then he dies. And Sickles is still around for another 30 years to talk about how he and his men saved the Union Army at Gettysburg. And it's left to his son, who was his aide-de-camp, to protect his reputation. And it just doesn't have the same gravitas to it as what people think Sickles' charges have.
Well, I have a question about Sickles. So Sickles, he's very instrumental in getting the ground, the real estate for what's now Gettysburg National Military Park. Did he have anything to do with how it was interpreted in those early, in his lifetime? Like when somebody would come here and the interpretation they would get, did he have any hand in that? Do we know?
I'm sure he did. Because he gets Longstreet to agree, you sort of messed our plans up. And that gives him credence,
Yeah, but wasn't that just while they were drinking?
Yeah, but then you can come back and talk about it. Well, this is what General Longstreet told me.
Well, Longstreet said.
Yeah. I'm sure every time he came here, he said, this is where I saved
And
America.
then that just got into, okay. So what were you going to say, Mary?
I was going to say, I don't know that, well, I agree with everything you said. I don't know how much influence that would have had over the locals who were doing the tours at the time.
Okay.
So I don't know. We know people that were doing the tours. I don't know that I've ever seen written much about how they were interpreting the battle. Except, we all know that licensed guiding comes about because there were people telling all sorts of stories. But I've never heard that connected to any particular interpretation of the battle. So it's a good question. I mean, certainly Sickles has outsized influence because he continues. I mean, this Historicus letter is hardly the last thing he writes about this. There's a second Historicus letter, and he continues to write in articles and other things. And every time he goes to a reunion, he talks about those things and burnishes his own reputation. And whether he expressly says anything against Meade, it doesn't matter because what he's doing is burnishing his own reputation at the expense of Meade.
And that's where I think his influence was, the people he's directly talking to.
Yeah, okay.
Right. Yeah. So we kind of get ourselves through this first set of witnesses, Sickles, Doubleday, Howe. They've now established testimony based on all of the charges. Those 5 charges have been brought. There's that meeting on March 4th to urge that with Wade and Chandler meeting with Lincoln to urge the removal of Meade.
Mm-hmm.
And then the next day, Meade comes back and testifies for a second time. He will eventually testify one more time for a very short period. But he again comes back on the 5th of March to testify in front of, this time, Wade and Chandler. And this is when, and Lewis has already referenced this, he walks in with a fistful of orders that he's given. And he's now had time to review the records. And, his initial testimony that was very much off the cuff and very much in response to a question of, so, hey, what happened to Gettysburg?
Mm-hmm.
And he just kind of doesn't ramble, but he talks uninterrupted for about 3 hours. This time, he's come back with orders, and in response to those specific charges, in particular, Pipe Creek, this is when he submits the entire Pipe Creek order into the record and starts to dispute the interpretation that Sickles has given to the Pipe Creek order. And he's really loaded for bear at this point. He emotionally defends himself, and we don't think of George Meade as expressing much emotion. He doesn't look like an emotional guy,
right?
But he certainly is at this point, and is very emotionally defending himself. And then after that, we have kind of a laundry list, and these guys all randomly come in. There doesn't seem to be any particular order to them. We get Pleasanton, who comes in, and this is one witness, Alfred Pleasanton, that Meade apparently is taken aback by, because Pleasanton kind of goes after Meade, and Meade's response to him is, does this guy not realize that I've supported his position, and he would have been dismissed long ago if I hadn't supported him? He writes that to his wife and is kind of astonished at how much of a turncoat Pleasanton is. And then Birney testifies, and Birney's got a past history with Meade as well. And that stems from Fredericksburg, where Birney believes that Meade did not come to his support at Fredericksburg, and like many of these guys, never seems to forget that. And then Warren comes in, and he has kind of favorable testimony or neutral testimony for Meade, and then Meade comes back again. And what he comes back again to talk about on March the 11th, and now those that are present are Wade, Chandler, who are two crazy radical Republicans, Julian Odell, Gooch, and Lone. So we've got 6 members of the committee at this point. And at this point, as Meade comes in again, the more neutral members of the committee who will defend Meade have picked up what's been going on, and they will come in and more vigorously cross-examine some of the next witnesses. And they will, when Meade testifies on the 11th, as he's disputing the interpretation that Butterfield, that he expects to come from these orders. Butterfield hasn't testified yet. But as he's trying to defend himself against that, some of these folks, some of these congressmen on the committee will elicit favorable testimony from Meade and kind of lead him through those things which will help him. So he finally has some defenders on the committee that will help him through this testimony to defend himself. Mm-hmm. So he testifies for the on the 11th.
I think, and when you were going through the timeline,
yep.
the 5th is his first appearance. Meade's first. On the 11th, he brings all the paperwork.
I'm sorry,
yeah.
He submits all the paperwork as evidence.
Right.
His next big testimony is April 4th, when he really starts to rebut everything that's been previously said against him.
Yeah. I'm sorry. You're right. Yeah. So he's, yeah.
Yeah. There's so you mentioned Pleasanton, and my favorite bit of Pleasanton is his is this quote here. He says, "I was satisfied from my general knowledge of the country, and so mentioned to General Meade several times that there was but one position in which for us to have a fight, and that was Gettysburg. And I had given orders to General Buford to hold that point to the last extremity until we could get there. That's my absolute favorite.
The only thing better than that is when he takes credit for killing Stonewall Jackson.
Oh, yeah.
Because
that was earlier.
He takes charge of our artillery line, and surely that artillery fires what dehorsed Jackson.
Yes, that's what did it.
When you evaluate testimony, you're looking for bias, you're looking for consistency, and clearly these guys are incredibly biased. And Pleasanton has a history of kind of outrageous statements. I mean, he'll take, and I think Sickles eventually gives him credit for establishing the Cemetery Hill position. I mean, it's crazy stuff.
Gives Pleasanton credit for that?
Yeah. And Pleasanton's happy to take it, by the way.
Of course.
He's highly politically motivated. So it's now we've got multiple people taking credit for determining the Cemetery Hill position.
That's interesting. That is interesting. Okay, so let's see. Back to the timeline here. So go ahead. Continue where you were left off.
So we've got, and again, let me go back and reiterate what Lewis said. Meade's first testimony is the 5th. His second is the 11th. And that's when he'll now have the support of some of these other members. And then we've got a laundry list of officers from the Army of the Potomac that will come in and testify. Humphreys comes in. He's very favorable to Meade. Hancock comes in. He's kind of neutral, perhaps more interested in burnishing his own reputation than anything else. He's got political aspirations.
He didn't take part in the retreat either.
And did not take part in the retreat. That's right. Wadsworth comes in, and then we get to Butterfield. And Butterfield is an interesting witness. His at the time that these hearings are taking place, Lewis, where's Butterfield?
Butterfield is out west with Joseph Hooker.
How about that?
And he gets wind of these hearings, essentially goes AWOL and shows up in D.C.
So another one who wasn't summoned.
He just shows up.
Or summoned.
Without leave. That's AWOL. And then, because who better to spin this tale that Meade wants to retreat on the morning of the 2nd than the guy
the guy was right
Meade
there
apparently
with him.
told, hey, we need to get some orders ready so we can get out of here.
Jeez.
But yeah, he's horrible.
Yeah.
I don't know what else to say. I just think he's horrible.
Yeah.
There are a couple of interesting things that happen around Butterfield's testimony. First, it's clear that he's in Washington for some period of time. I've forgotten exactly, but at least a couple of weeks before he actually testifies. And so it certainly leaves the impression that he's colluding with Sickles and reviewing documents. But his testimony eventually is not as bad for Meade as I think Sickles and some of the others were hoping. He testifies on a Friday, and then there's a weekend break, and then he comes back again on Monday. And he's clearly been talked to in between Friday and Monday about how his testimony isn't quite as derogatory to Meade as it should be. And so he initially leaves the impression, for instance, that the Pipe Creek Circular was a retreat order, but he omits omits those important portions of the circular the way Sickles did. And he notes that he advised Meade that pulling that back to Pipe Creek would damage any morale, but he never categorically states that it was Meade's intent to withdraw from Gettysburg, and instead tells the committee that they'll have to ask Meade. So that's a disappointment to Sickles and Doubleday. And then there's a weekend adjournment, and Butterfield returns to now criticize the Pipe Creek Circular as not judicious. So he's trying to have it both ways.
Yeah.
And taken as a whole, his testimony really is disappointing to Sickles and the committee, but he makes me seem like he's overwhelmed and by this new command. And then when it comes to this July 2nd retreat order, Butterfield testifies that Meade told him to prepare the order, which is what he's there to testify about. But when he's asked whether the attack in the peach orchard preempted the issuance of the retreat order, which is what Sickles is trying to argue, that because Sickles becomes engaged, that's what stops Meade from issuing that retreat order, Butterfield a waffle, saying it's impossible for me to state that because General Meade had not communicated to me his intention to execute that order, regardless of the opinions of the Corps commanders or whether he intended to have the order submitted to them. He merely directed me to prepare such an order, which I did. It is for him to say whether he intended to execute it or not. He may have desired it prepared for an emergency without any view of executing it then, or he may have had it prepared with a full view to its execution. And so he's waffling like crazy.
And if this would have been like a criminal court, and the defense's objective is to create doubt in the jury's mind, that doubt in this instance would have come from the Assistant Adjutant General, Brigadier General Seth Williams, who testifies after Butterfield. There's a few witnesses in between. Right. But the process would be Meade tells Butterfield, I want this order drawn up. He would go, Butterfield would go to Williams, and Williams would get enough copies for proper distribution. Mm-hmm. So if this particular order was told to Butterfield to draw up, then Butterfield would he would draw up the order, then give it to Seth Williams to make sufficient copies for all the Corps commanders. When Seth Williams testifies, he states that particular order in question, however, was never distributed. No vestige of it is to be found among any of the records in my office, and further that the order was never recorded or issued in any sense. So that creates the doubt. If this, my example of a criminal trial, it's not clear.
Yeah, and in addition to that, there's at Butterfield's testimony, there's a question by Gooch, who is a member of the committee and a supporter of Meade. And as he questions Butterfield about precisely that, Lewis, Butterfield acknowledges that the July 2nd order is not in the official records.
Yeah.
And so was not issued.
Yeah.
What's interesting is that even though this testimony is disappointing, ultimately when Wade writes the committee report, which, and we haven't talked about how long it takes for this report to come out, it literally comes out after Lincoln's dead. Wade writes the report. In that report, he will kind of right over this uncertainty of Butterfield. And so he will have the last say on how this is presented in the report, and he'll just ignore that uncertainty of Butterfield.
You see how it goes, folks? Don't believe what they tell you.
And that report goes back to what Meade wrote to his wife about the bad thing that's going to come out of this is how people perceive my leadership then.
Absolutely.
And he's right.
Posterity, yeah. The other big, real quick, the person that refutes this order is Hunt. Henry Hunt's brought in. He's in charge of the artillery reserve. It takes a lot to get all that artillery moving in a certain way.
Sure.
And Hunt, when asked about it, he says, I know of no such order and no such intention. I presume if any such intention had been entertained, I should have known of it as soon as anybody, as the first thing to have been done was to get rid of all the large reserve artillery and ammunition train under my charge. So if Meade wanted to retreat and had any designs, what Hunt's testifying to, Hunt would have been told, because it takes a lot to get all that artillery and the ammunition train going, and they'd had to hit the road first.
Right.
And he knows nothing about that.
And Hunt isn't the only one. You've got Sedgwick, Williams, Crawford. These guys are all testifying for him. Wadsworth. Lewis, you have here Hancock was for, but Mary, you said he was kind of neutral.
My impression of his testimony is that he's certainly not unfavorable to Meade, but there are a number of times when I read it, I think Hancock could be more supportive of Meade, and whether he decides not to or whether he's worried about his own reputation. I find that he's not as favorable, for instance, as some others.
Is there any truth to Hancock thinking that the 5th and 6th Corps were going to support him should Pickett's charge, which they didn't know was going to be Pickett's charge, but if there was an attack on the center, that they were going to support him and counterattack if the Confederate attack failed? And is there any... Was he really that disappointed that didn't happen? Because I've read that claim made.
According to him, he says that it's a shame him, Hancock, and Gibbon are wounded and not available to advise Meade, because it was their intention that, he says that he told Meade, if we repulse this thing, we need to immediately counterattack.
Right.
Because we're going to be in disarray, and that'll be our chance. But, of course, it's easy to say what you'd have done if you don't do it.
Right. And it's also, Meade, didn't he return after Pickett's charge was repulsed and say, oh, we won? Like he wasn't even there, right? He was down the Round Top area, I think.
He goes over near Powers Hill in that area, and that's a shame. But it's because of all the flying Confederate artillery landing around the Lydia Leicester house and all the dead horses and stuff. And that's just, for Meade's sake, that's a shame that incident happens, because it doesn't do him any favors.
It makes it look like he's not...
He's just an airhead wandering around. Everybody else is doing the hard thinking work. So
right. When I guess appropriately, he's making sure he's not hurt and that he's there to command the army. And everything I've read is that he's in pretty good communication with what's going on up on Cemetery Ridge. So he's not quite as absent as I think some people would suggest he is. Certainly physically absent.
Right.
But the sense I get is that he's communicating with what's going on. So I think when you look at some of the testimony, again, when we go back to the testimony of Hancock. So, for instance, one of the things Hancock gets asked is, would you have known of an order to retreat if it had been published? And what is it? Hancock doesn't say, well, of course I would have. He says, I suppose so. The movement could not have been made without my knowledge. Now, that's a little bit different than, of course I would have heard it.
Right.
And that's what I mean by he could have been, I think, more supportive. And I'm a huge Hancock fan too, but there are things within his testimony that just seem to me as though he's making sure. I mean, first of all, he's a Democrat, and very clearly a Democrat, very publicly a Democrat. And of course, will run for president on the Democrat ticket in 1880.
Right.
And so he's in sync with, even though he's a West Pointer, he's in sync with these committee members. I think he could have been more supportive.
Yeah, and on my list, Matt, that I had you, if you're not against Meade, I put 4. And some of those are just neutral. They get up there and they tell the story as best they know it.
Right.
Unlike the first 3 witnesses
who were
totally
clearly against.
Yeah. I'd write real quick before we head to the end. I want to get back to Birney, because Birney's an interesting guy to me. Birney, of course, is the division commander in Sickles. He's holding the left part of Sickles' line once they move forward.
And here you say he's against, although he tries to play it both ways.
During his testimony, he also states that he occupied Little Round Top. So he's saying, we were there. We were where we were supposed to be. Clearly they weren't. But then afterwards, he realizes he's done some damage, I think, to Meade. And Meade would write his wife on April 11th, 1864. There is no doubt General Birney is scared at the turn things have taken in the Sickles matter. For I received a note from Hancock the other day saying Birney had been to see him, disclaiming being a partisan of Sickles and saying he would like to come and see me to explain matters. So he clearly is having, I don't know whether it's he sees which way the wind's blowing, that Meade's going to stay in charge of the Army of the Potomac, or he generally has these feelings like, I shouldn't have done that. Meade's a good guy, and, I don't know. He actually stays in the Army of the Potomac, and he eventually gets moved over to the Army of the James as a corps commander it's Grant that elevates him. He sort of has a sad ending in October of 1864. He, like a lot of soldiers, gets diarrhea, and he has all these gastrointestinal problems, and that's what he's going to die from. Very inglorious soldier death.
It's a shitty way to go.
Literally. It's just his end is kind of sad to me. But that's interesting that he sees them as what he's done, whether it's a real change of heart or he says, oh, well, I got to work for this guy still.
Yeah.
And it ain't going to be fun if we leave things. So he makes this overture towards me.
Right. And he still has with him that antagonistic history left over from Fredericksburg.
Yeah.
So he's trying to clean up a couple of things, I think. And again, when you look at his testimony, he is just plain inaccurate about the Council of War.
Yeah.
On July the 2nd, he'll talk about how it was divided, and the statements that he attributes to Meade aren't corroborated by any other witnesses. So when you look at the value of testimony, and this kind of falls forward into how are we interpreting this testimony today as it shows up in the literature. Yes, was this under oath? Sure. But what are the biases? Or is there witness corroboration? Were they testifying to firsthand knowledge or hearsay? All of those things should come into the way we evaluate this testimony today, and it often does not.
Yeah, the under oath thing I threw out the window.
Yeah, even today.
If you don't think you're going to get caught, you lie your rear end off.
I have never, in my knowledge of everything that goes on in D.C. politics, I can't recall in my lifetime someone even being brought up on charges of perjury. Well, except I guess Bill Clinton. That was perjury, wasn't it?
Yeah, sex with that woman.
Yeah, no, I didn't ask him to lie.
I don't know what you call it.
I want to get back to work for the American people.
In the closet. I don't know what happened. It was dark.
No, I don't. I love my wife, but no, okay, except for him. I don't. Yeah. I've seen many other people testify before Congress under penalty of perjury and never get brought up on charge. And we know that you just know if they're opening their mouth and they're in D.C., someone is lying.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, look at Michael Flynn. It's very much we'll go after the guys we want to go after.
Yes,
and we won't go after. And I think once the war is over, and I think that you see this result in the report itself, because this report doesn't get issued until the war is over, Lincoln's dead, now we're all worried about Reconstruction.
Yeah.
Nobody cares. I mean, this thing gets published, but there's nobody paying any attention to it.
Right. What does it matter at this point?
Yeah.
Right. And so the chance that anybody's going to be brought up on perjury charges is slim and none. But what that does mean is that it leaves hanging out there all of this testimony with all of the biases and all of the mischaracterizations, historians now to pick up and directly quote some of this testimony that I think the objective observer today would say isn't anywhere close to true.
Yeah, I know. And that's what's so disheartening about it.
In the report itself, again, that comes out May 22nd, 1865, as Mary said, after the war. It has some, one outrageous thing is when Howe's testimony, he's testimony how, the position sort of did the work for you. Wade adds in there about, Howe's testimony states that no great generalship was needed to win this battle. Wade adds, as if Howe says this, for none was needed. Like this is an add-on. Howe never says that.
Right.
And then it has that statement that I alluded to earlier, that the 3 days of battle had been, for the most part, comparatively days of rest.
Yeah, which
like
is
a picnic.
astounding
we went to Gettysburg
to me.
For a little vacation.
I mean, the casualties, they're basically the same, 20-something thousand each, right?
It goes back to our get out of the car, the last, the one we did over on Culp's Hill, where I read an account where, everything happens on that night of July 2nd going into the 3rd. Those soldiers over there stayed awake all night, anticipating this fight they knew was coming in the morning.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no rest.
No.
So
No, there's no. Yeah, just because you're not running around. Please, don't even get me started. I read these things and it just makes me so angry.
But Mary is right, and I get the same thing. A lot of people come to the field. They don't realize who the Union general is.
Yeah.
You got to inform them.
Yeah.
And then they think, well, he must have been relieved. They don't realize that's the last Army of the Potomac commander there is.
Yeah.
He goes through the rest
Right.
of the war.
Right.
And afterwards, he's going to write that Gettysburg is the most important thing that went on with the Army of the Potomac. And that's, of course, his pinnacle. Right. I know we're getting to the end. I want to read you this quote of how the report, the testimony goes, just like going back to what Meade wrote his wife about, this is going to have an effect on how people view my generalship. This is a book written in 1904. It's the life and letters of Judge Thomas J. Anderson and his wife. He's from Ohio. He's writing a note to his son, James Anderson, and that's who edited and annotated this book. And he's talking about this is July 7th, 1863. At this writing, we have no exact information. We expect to destroy or capture the rebel army before it gets back to Virginia. He's writing about the Battle of Gettysburg. There's a footnote here. The footnote's put in by his son in 1904. The footnote is, a capable general in the place of General Meade would have captured Lee's rebel army and probably then and there ended the war. Failing to do so was the gigantic blunder of the war. This is a guy writing in 1904, and no doubt this type of attitude is shaped by what we've spent the last 2 hours discussing.
And I wish we had more time, because what I'd love to do, maybe you guys can come back again in a couple months and we can take some of the big testimonies from the people who were against Meade and really parse them and explain to the audience why they're wrong, why they're incorrect.
Well, we didn't get to the questions either.
And we didn't get to the. We have a couple. Actually, we have time for the questions, but I don't have time for all that other stuff I'd like to
maybe
do.
Based on this, some people, and this made me think of it, submit
more questions. Yeah. And then we could do this. We could pick up more later on. All right, let's see. Our Patreon user, Sack Attack, his name is Kevin. Kevin Sackett. He, I think he's a new patron, actually, and he has two questions. He goes, were there ever any repercussions for anyone testifying during the hearing against Meade? I'm assuming he means. Anybody there?
Other than the way we view people through history, because the people that were relieved before the testimony.
Right.
Sickles, loses his leg. He never comes back to command. Doubleday is relieved on the field. Then he leaves the Army of the Potomac on July 7th, 1863. And Albion Howe is relieved right before the week before testimony starts.
Okay.
He stays in the military. He ends up part of the honor guard with Lincoln's body, and he's also on the commission that tries the conspirators that assassinate him. But I think, I think the people, Meade's left in place. Those people are left in place. They move around to different positions. And Hooker, he's out west. He does a decent job.
But nobody that badmouths Meade. Well, let's see. Any of the guys that badmouth him, do they stay under his command after?
Bernie is still there. Bernie gets
Bernie
later
is still
on.
there. Yeah.
But Bernie's wishy-washy, though.
And
He's
Warren's,
not totally.
Warren doesn't badmouth him, but he's still there. I think the repercussions of all this are historical.
Yeah.
It's how we view these people
today,
based on either the whoppers they told or the whoppers they get told against them.
Yeah.
I think, and I often get the question when I talk about Sickles, well, did he ever get court-martialed? And of course, the answer is no.
He got the Medal of Honor.
He lived a long, happy life with honor. And so none of these guys get court-martialed. No, there are no adverse impacts immediately to their Army careers or their post-war careers based on this testimony.
Yeah.
It is, as Lewis points out and as Meade points out, it's the damage that's done to Meade's reputation that is probably the longest-lasting adverse effect of this whole sad affair.
Well, we're gonna turn that around. That's what we're gonna do.
We're on the Meade redemption train.
Yes, we're gonna start defend
Rah,
Meade.
Meade.
Yeah. The second part of Kevin's questions is, what were the thoughts of individuals such as Lincoln, Grant, Meade, et cetera, at A, even having the inquiry, and B, the aftermath?
I don't think any president's enthralled with these committees up to this day.
I think Lincoln's position and his actions with respect to the committee kind of are benign tolerance. He knows he can't stop the committee from happening, and he will meet with these guys often, especially in the first couple of years. But he does, the typical Lincoln. He'll listen, he lets them vent, and then he does what he wants to do anyway. So it's, I think, viewed as a political expediency for him. I think Grant is largely unaffected by all of this. His reputation and his relationship with Lincoln fully protect him from the downsides of these committees and posts. And once he takes command as General-in-Chief and moves with me, there are very few investigations. Once Grant's in charge of the Army of the Potomac, this idea of let's investigate the Army of the Potomac starts to go away, and they instead start to investigate other things that are not battlefield related. And so I think Grant is unaffected by it.
Yeah, I think when this happens, the ace Lincoln has up his sleeve is Grant. He knows he's going to appoint him. And so that's why they don't entertain Meade being relieved, because they're bringing Grant east.
Right.
And Grant takes over for Halleck. He just moves his office to the field, and that's the biggest difference.
Was that the plan for Grant, or is that something he decided after he came out here?
I think he decided on his own.
But
this is where I want to be.
Right.
With the Army.
It seems to me, I've read people recommending to him, don't get sucked into Washington.
Okay.
Find another place. And even some people who suggested stay out west. There's no reason for you to go east.
Good point.
And I think he decided staying out west was not the right answer, but Washington wasn't either.
And I think if he maintains an office in D.C., the war lasts longer, because he's not right there seeing firsthand what's going on.
Yeah, right. And there's that delay. And absolutely.
So. Yeah. I think. We kind of touched on this early on, but another way to evaluate Lincoln's relationship with the committee is that when he removes Fremont early on because of that emancipation order, the committee will push and push and push for Fremont to be reinstated. And so Lincoln reinstates him, but where does he put him? In the Mountain Department of Virginia, where people go to get lost. So he'll effectively bow to the demands of the committee, but he's the one that controls how that happens. And I think that's another classic Lincoln, okay, fine, but ha-ha.
Yeah, right.
Where I'm going to put it.
I love that. Scott Fosnacht asked the question, how would you describe the relationship between the committee and Lincoln, which you just kind of answered right there. So thank you, Scott. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Steve, for all the questions that you sent in. Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Lewis. And ladies and gentlemen, let this be a lesson as you learn more about the Committee on the Conduct of the War, and you know the truth now that you study the Battle of Gettysburg, and you hear what these people say under oath in their testimonies, and it's not unique to this particular committee and this particular instance. It never ends to this very day. So just remember that. And stop fighting with each other over stupid things with your stupid camps. Because it's all a lie.
History repeats itself.
It does. It never stops repeating itself. It just never stops. It's rinse and repeat. Rinse and repeat, Veronica. All right, ladies and gentlemen.
Just like people's hair.
Wait, yeah. I would stay. I
don't have any, but
yeah, I don't know what you're talking about. My chest hair. I would stay with this for 2 more hours if I could, but we have another interview scheduled at 1, I believe. So I have to move this along. But let's come back and let's do this again in a few months, Mary and Lewis. We're gonna parse everybody's testimony next time, and we're gonna call BS on them. Okay,
that sounds good. Yeah.
That would be fun. I like that.
Yeah, that would be fun.
And Veronica's a defense attorney. Maybe we can hold a mock trial of George Meade.
You're his attorney.
You could be his
bono
attorney.
work.
Yeah, of course, it'd be pro bono. But no, maybe we should do that because we have two lawyers here. So maybe Mary, would you want to act as prosecutor, and I'll be the judge?
I'm happy as any good lawyer is. I'm happy to play either side of the street.
Perfect. Well, maybe let's do that.
Yeah.
I've always wanted to be the judge. I'll be like Judge Ito. I'll have all my hourglasses, and I'll wear a Ruth Bader Ginsburg doily around my neck.
You'd be a lot richer
There
if you were
you
Judge
go.
Judy.
We'll make Lewis be me.
Yeah, there you go. Oh, that would be good.
I'll see if I can run the pickets again coming up into Pennsylvania, like I did this morning.
There you go.
All right, everybody. Well, thank you very much for coming on. Thank you all for listening. I hope you enjoyed this. This is a slightly different Ask a Guide, but I hope it was fun for you, and we'll talk to you next time.
Thank you.
Have a good one.
Great,
All right. Thank you very much, Mary. That was great.
Our hearts so stout have got us vain, for soon 'tis known from whence we came. Wherever we go, they dread the name of Gary Owen in glory. Instead of spa, we'll drink down ale and pay the reckoning on the nail. No man for debt shall go to jail from Gary Owen in glory. Instead of spa, we'll drink down ale and pay the reckoning on the nail. No man for debt shall go to jail